What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Genesis Apologetics. They recently put out a whole bunch of 1-minute videos where this high school student, or just a school student in general, is challenging their science teacher on evolution. They do cover a wide range of topics, so we're only going to be handling a few of those today. Most notably, abiogenesis, epigenetics, and mitochondrial Eve. Even though these are 1 minute long, they get everything wrong in each of these videos, which is pretty much par for the course for Genesis Apologetics. So if you heathens want to fuck around and find out how bad these Genesis Apologetics videos are, then please stay tuned.
It says here, our traits are passed down according to our genetic code, according to a very specific set of rules first observed by Gregor Mendel. And in my opinion, that's a huge blow to evolution.
Okay, I don't understand how that could be a huge blow to evolution. That's basically explaining how traits are passed on from generation to generation. So I don't see how this is a big win or a gotcha for the creationist side. In fact, I would say that the way that our genetic code works and the way that organisms propagate in general is not solved by the creationist model. They just draw a cloud in the sky and they write magic on it in order to explain everything. And that's never going to be more parsimonious than empirical evidence and just science in general.
Okay, I can't wait to hear this.
Okay, so first, life has never been observed to come from non-life. Ever.
While true, we haven't observed life coming from non-life, that doesn't mean that life can't just arise on its own from non-organic materials. See, the fundamental assumption here in this line of argumentation is that unless you can adhere to their straw man version of science, that automatically means that God is the best explanation. It's not. The prior probability of any God explanation surpassing any natural explanation is very small. So small that it's negligible. So if I were to hedge my bets on which explanation will either eventually pan out or makes more sense even now, I'm gonna put all of my chips on a natural explanation, because the God explanation has never stood up to any natural explanation. But more importantly, like I said before, we don't have the empirical evidence of life coming from non-life. But what we do have is a mountain of evidence that shows that abiogenesis most likely did happen naturally. We have information that outlines the process, and it's really not that hard to fill in the gaps. So while it's true that we don't have any kind of experiment or evidence that life just spontaneously came into existence from non-organic materials, we have enough information in order to make a strong inference that a natural process like abiogenesis is most likely the best explanation. And just to put both of these quote-unquote competing ideas into perspective here, we have the scientific method on one hand that doesn't necessarily require direct evidence of what we're trying to prove, and then we've got this dude over here drawing a cloud and saying magic, and that's how his God did it. These two things are not the same.
Second, to date, there is no known observable process by which new genetic information can be added to the genetic code of any organism.
Well, that's just flat out fucking false. And I'm also going to need a citation on where you got this info. New genetic information is added all the time. As far as empirical evidence showing that mutations can add new information to the genetic code, we have evidence of increased genetic variety in a population, increased genetic material, novel genetic material, and novel genetically regulated abilities. Furthermore, the process of mutation and selection is observed to increase information in the genetic code in simulations. So I don't exactly understand what he's talking about when he says that there's no new genetic information that's added, because we often see major changes to the genome. Like, for instance, with our own evolution, in chromosome 2, we see where there was a fusion between two different chromosomes. And I would say that that's a pretty big change right there. This is one piece of evidence that clues us into us sharing a common ancestor with the other great apes. Another way new genetic information can be inserted into an organism's genetic code is endogenous retroviruses. We actually have a number of genetic sequences that can be traced back to endogenous retroviruses. Another way that new genetic information can be introduced to genetic code is through endogenous retroviruses. We even have some genetic sequences that can be traced back to endogenous retroviruses. This is also another way in which we've been able to connect our evolutionary lineage to the other great apes. So this whole idea that new genetic information through mutation or through any other process can't be introduced to the genetic code is just flat out fucking false.
Without these, evolution's dead in the water. I mean, these aren't just side issues. These are imperative to evolutionary theory.
True, changes in the genetic code are pretty integral to evolutionary theory, but again, evolution is just the description of how organisms change over time. Mutations are just one particular way in which these organisms can change over time. There are other ways in which they can change. Like, for instance, another way is the endogenous retroviruses, like I mentioned before. So again, this young man here is automatically assuming that because he's found some kind of app, probably the Genesis Apologetics app that they've got out there, that says that there's a problem with this and evolution, that means that there actually is a problem with it without actually checking the source material. This is a bad way to go through life. Don't be like this guy.
If you can't get the evolutionary car started, you can't move it down the street. So, Professor, is there any new evidence you have to answer these 2 points?
First of all, this guy shouldn't be asking his either college professor or high school teacher to provide him with new evidence that refutes what he's saying, because we already have the information that what he's saying is wrong. He's just regurgitating wrong information that's been given to him by, in this case, Genesis Apologetics, or rather the intelligent design crowd or creationism crowd, either one that you want to pick for this, they're all the same. But basically, he's just using shit that other people have pulled out of their ass and claim that evolution cannot answer or has not been answered in the scientific source material. It has been.
Let me check the science journals.
I think that this is a wrong answer to give this student from the teacher's position, primarily because it makes it sound like, you have to do the legwork for the student. The information's already out there, and if you're in a class that's directly related to evolution, then chances are the teacher or professor is going to know the source material that you need to consult. So obviously, Genesis Apologetics is strawmanning the teacher's position here. I mean, we expected this to happen because it's Genesis Apologetics, right? Well, that's going to be it for the abiogenesis talk. Now we're going to move on to epigenetics.
What did you just say disproves evolution?
Mice, lizards, and finches, of course.
I like how he says, of course. Like, the teacher should already know this, or that this is such simple information that everybody should know it. We have no idea what the fuck you're talking about, dude. I don't understand how any of those things would disprove evolution, primarily because they are products of evolution. In fact, every organism that exists on this planet now is a product of evolution, because evolution continues happening. It's an ongoing process. So I don't know what the fuck he's talking about.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean. Evolution is driven by nature selecting the fittest creatures to survive and reproduce, passing on their favorable traits while the others die out.
I feel like this is a bad representation of evolution. Because, evolution by natural selection is one possible way for evolution to happen, but it's not the only way for evolution to happen. Also, the way that the teacher recited what natural selection is, or I guess even what the concept of evolution is all wrong. Natural selection doesn't select for the fittest animal in the way that they are probably thinking. I feel like a better way to phrase this would be the best adapted organism, or the organism that adapts the quickest or the best to the environment it exists within. That's the way that natural selection works. Other organisms are unable to survive as good as the organisms that have adapted to the environment. So those other not so well adapted organisms don't survive in the environment long enough to propagate. The ones that are adapted to survive in the environment do propagate, and they end up changing the species for the better because the species is able to survive in the environment better. Typically, when creationists mention the survival of the fittest, they mean the biggest and the strongest and the most immoral of all of the animals. The animal that's just cutthroat and they will just kill anything to survive. Those are the ones that survive. That's survival of the fittest to them. But that's not what that phrase means.
Well, how's that happen, Professor?
Well, mutations and natural selection.
But research is now showing that creatures are pre-programmed to adapt to their environments in just a few generations.
Organisms are pre-programmed to adapt to their environment in just a few generations. I have no idea what in the fuck he could be talking about. First of all, the genetic diversity that exists within the organisms on the planet Earth are so diverse that you could never program in enough genetic information in order to make them so adaptable that in just a few generations they're perfectly adapted for the environment that they exist in. That would require an immense amount of genetic code that simply isn't found in nature. Even within the kinds of species that are typically mentioned by creationists, there's so much genetic diversity there that the genetic code is just simply not big enough in order to hold all that information. That's why mutations as well as epigenetic information is important for an animal to adapt to its environment. Now, like I said, this section is talking about epigenetics. Epigenetics controls gene expression, but it's also very integral to the evolutionary process. But creationists, like this student here, thinks that this is some kind of pre-programming adaptation into an animal. But as we'll come to see, that his creationist idea that epigenetics helps his particular position doesn't actually help him at all.
You see, their survivability is not just dependent on random chance, but it's because they're created to do so.
Well, no. For one thing, animals are not created to survive. First of all, an organism's ability to survive depends on the environment that they currently exist within. If their environment changes, they can either adapt to the new environment or they can change environments to something that they're more suited for. Of course, sometimes an animal has to adapt to its new environment because the environment has changed and they can't move to an already existing environment that they're already adapted to. And so they are forced to either adapt or perish. So no organism is made to survive in any environment because the environments on the planet Earth change all the time. It makes no sense to say that each animal is engineered or created specifically to exist in the environment that they are currently found in, when the environment that they are currently found in hasn't always existed. But also, if you can't tell, this guy is just drawing a magical bubble in the air and writing magic on it in order to explain a number of things that we see in nature, specifically why organisms survive in the environment that they currently exist within. That's for one. For two, he's trying to explain how organisms can change and adapt to different environments. But there's one particular type of species out there that breaks this notion and renders his whole counter argument here null and void. That would be ring species. I'm sure that there are a number of other situations out there that breaks his whole hypothesis, but ring species is a good go-to one that's easy to explain to people. You see, a ring species is when a group of organisms get separated and they diverge on their evolutionary lineage and they end up having to change and survive in different environments. By the time they meet up around on the other side, completing the ring, they are so genetically different that they can't propagate with each other. They are still quote unquote the same kind, but they are so genetically different that they are no longer able to procreate. This represents a significant genetic change, not just an epigenetic change or epigenetics expressing different traits so that they adapt to their own environments. These are whole ass mutations that cause a deep genetic change in the animal. So I would love for creationists like this guy in this video to explain a ring species on his whole hypothesis of God created them specially and pre-program adaptations into them so that epigenetics can change the expression of the genes whenever they want to.
Here's where the finches come in, okay? Darwin believed the different shapes and sizes of finch feet and beaks, depending on their different islands, was showing evolution, right? But this is where epigenetics comes in, okay? So, mice. They can grow different vertebrae depending on if they're in the forest or in the prairie. Lizards can grow longer legs depending on their location. You see, this isn't just some random act of chance. This is pre-programmed epigenetics.
So his whole explanation here requires a few assumptions on his part. First of all, the assumption that all organisms are not related to each other, when we know that to be factually incorrect. We know that all organisms are related to each other. We can trace our evolutionary lineage back to single-celled organisms. So he starts with the assumption that each organism, each kind of organism, is specially created by God or by some intelligent designer in order to survive in various environments. Now, while it may be true that those organisms have those epigenetic traits where they can change the gene expression so that they can adapt and survive in the environment, those epigenetic expressions can be passed generationally and thus do influence the evolution of those animals. And if those animals stay in the environment for a long enough period of time, or they change into drastically different environments, they can genetically change so much that they are unable to procreate with other members of their clade, just like with a ring species. Now, I'm going to have this article linked down below, but I do want to read directly from a paper that specifically tackles this whole idea of how epigenetics directly influences evolutionary paths. Nonetheless, there is growing appreciation that epigenetic variation makes direct and indirect contributions to evolutionary processes. First, some epigenetic states are transmitted intergenerationally and affect the phenotype of offspring. Moreover, bona fide heritable epialleles exist and are quite common in plants. Such epialleles could therefore be subject to natural selection in the same way as conventional DNA sequence-based alleles. Second, epigenetic variation enhances phenotypic plasticity and phenotypic variance, and thus can modulate the effect of natural selection on sequence-based genetic variation. Third, given that phenotypic plasticity is central to the adaptability of organisms, epigenetic mechanisms that generate plasticity and acclimation are important to consider in evolutionary theory. Fourth, some genes are under selection to be imprinted, identifying the sex of the parent from which they were derived, leading to parent of origin dependent gene expression and effects. These effects can generate hybrid dysfunction and contribute to speciation. Finally, epigenetic processes, particularly DNA methylation, contribute directly to DNA sequence evolution because they act as mutagens on the one hand and modulate genome stability on the other by keeping transposable elements in check. Basically, what all of that said was that epigenetics plays a significant role in the evolutionary process. These epigenetic states that this guy is mentioning in this video can be passed on through generations. The epialleles, which would be the alleles that code for these epigenetic sequences, can be selected for, just in the same way as any other part of the DNA sequence. Also, the fact that epigenetics helps with the adaptation and survivability of a species. Also, the fact that epigenetics helps with the adaptability and survivability of a species. Also, the fact that epigenetics helps with the adaptability and survivability of an organism. That means that it must play a role in the evolutionary process. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that this guy doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and he needs to do a little bit more time studying and pull his head out of Genesis Apologetics ass. Basically, what I'm saying is that this guy doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, and that he needs to go back, do more research, he needs to go back, look at the source material, and pull his head out of Genesis Apologetics' ass. All right, so next up is Mitochondrial Eve. Let's see where they go with this.
Evolution isn't true.
Says who?
Your mom.
What?
Well, mitochondrial DNA is passed on from our moms. And while evolutionists say that human evolution started about 100,000 years ago, some controversial mitochondrial DNA says that it may have started much more recently.
I'm not exactly sure what controversial mitochondrial information he's talking about. They're all being very vague in every one of these clips, but scientists don't say that human evolution started 100,000 years ago, or that even Homo sapiens came about 100,000 years ago. Homo sapiens seem to evolve from the other great apes in Africa about 300,000 years ago. But prior to that, there were other human-like, and since we're all apes, ape-like ancestors. The genus Homo actually can be found going back as far as 2.8 to 2.75 million years ago. At least that's the earliest fossil evidence that we have. Now, as far as this mitochondrial evidence that he's talking about, I don't understand where he's going with this, because the mitochondrial Eve that is normally touted out by creationists, that individual lived around 155,000 years ago, so it's even farther back than he's trying to suggest. But still, that doesn't represent the first female. That's just how far back can we trace our mitochondrial lineage, and that one individual is the farthest that we can trace back. Not that they were the first Homo sapien female, just that that's the farthest we can trace it back.
Well, they showed that the observed DNA mutation rates actually point back to the first woman about 6,500 years ago.
For one thing, this entire idea right here that these mutation rates only point to like 6,000 years ago as far as humans developing, that makes literally no sense. For one thing, it assumes a stable mutation rate, and mutation rates have not always been stable. They fluctuated throughout time. Also, the entire premise that there's just not enough time for the mutations to happen just totally ignores how mutations actually occur. They ignore the fact that mutations can happen in parallel, so it's not like you have to have one right after the other, right after the other. They can happen in one group of organisms, and then that group of organisms merge with another group of organisms, and through genetic drift and other sexual selection type of interactions between these groups, one group can develop one particular mutation, another group can develop another mutation, and when those two groups merge, they produce an individual that has both mutations. Now, that's just one possibility. There's multiple different possibilities for how all of these mutations can accumulate over time. But to say that the mutation rate only gets us back to 6,000 years ago, let's put that into perspective. The human race didn't start with organized agriculture until about 11,000 years ago. So saying that, the mutation rate only gets us back to 6,000 years, I'd have to see your work on that. And they're not providing any citations. So what can be dismissed without any kind of evidence and is thoroughly refuted with current evidence can be easily dismissed.
Well, the Science Journal is also saying that evolutionists are more concerned with a faster mutation rate, probably because it contradicts human evolution.
No, it's not that we need a fast mutation rate. It's the fact that we've observed a variable mutation rate, and that there are various ways in which multiple mutations can pile up over time and end up changing a species either rapidly or slowly over a period of time. Now, just keep in mind that the Homo genus came onto the scene 2.8 million years ago. And so there's been 2.8 million years of evolution, and Homo sapiens first appeared 300,000 years ago. So you're talking about like 2.5 million years of evolution between when the Homo genus first appeared and 300,000 years ago. That's a lot of adaptation. That's a lot of generations. That's a lot of sexual selection. That's a lot of natural selection. But you see, here's what they're not telling you, is that because the mutation rates are variable and that multiple mutations can happen simultaneously or independently of each other and then later combine in order to produce a more survivable organism, like all of those things are problems for the creationist model. What they need is that 6,000 year time frame. So whenever they look at the evidence, like the mitochondrial evidence or anything like that, of course they're going to come up with a 6,000 year timeline. Of course they're going to make assumptions that are just outrageous to make. Like the primary assumption that most creationists make, that organisms are not related to each other, like different organisms. Of course, creationists are not going to agree that whales were once land animals. But the fossil evidence that we have shows that they were once land animals. And there's existing evidence in the skeletal structure of whales and dolphins and other animals in that particular clade, because they still have those rear hind legs that sort of sprout off of their back end. Those are vestigial limbs. Now, that doesn't mean that they haven't found some kind of use for them now, but it does mean that they were once used in a completely different way for legs. Why would a whale need legs? Well, it makes sense if they were once land animals. Of course, these are uncomfortable facts for creationists. They are the ones that need the evidence to work out in a certain way. Normal people that accept evolution for the fact that it is, we just have to work with the information that's just there in nature. We take it however it comes. We don't have to manipulate data. That's what creationists do.
Well, these discoveries have even contributed to the development of new research guidelines used by the FBI in forensic investigations. But I'd say it's mere coincidence that these ages coincide with the Bible. Or is it?
I don't know what kind of guidelines that she's talking about. I don't know. They're just being so vague about everything that it seems nonsensical. Like, how would the FBI producing guidelines based on some kind of research out there, how would that affect the mountains of evidence that we have for evolution? The answer is that it doesn't. It doesn't affect it. Whatever kind of guidelines the FBI could come up with whatever kind of research that they're talking about is still not going to affect the evolutionary evidence that we have in either the fossil record or the DNA evidence. They have to automatically assume that the mutation rate can only get us back to 6,000 years. They have to assume that God created different kinds of organisms instead of all organisms originating from a common ancestor. They have to forego actual scientific knowledge in order for their position to make any kind of sense. And then they just have to draw a cloud in the sky and label it magic in order to explain everything. But to round out this particular part of this classroom video, the mitochondrial DNA doesn't pose any kind of problem for evolution. What the mitochondrial DNA can point us to is the earliest ancestor that we inherit our mitochondrial DNA from. And you know what? The Y chromosomal atom lived even farther back than that, showing that this is just the earliest individual that we can actually trace our lineage to. And none of that is going to affect the evolutionary process or the explanations for the diversity of life on this planet that don't include a magical wizard in the sky. I'm going to have some resources down below if you want to learn more about epigenetics as well as other topics that we covered in this video. But basically, you don't have to be an evolutionary biologist or an expert in genetics or anything like that in order to know that Genesis Apologetics is just pulling shit out of their ass. They're regurgitating common creationist tropes to a new generation of people on the internet. They are indoctrinating people into ignorance, and that is what is contributing to a lot of the ills that we have today. Genesis Apologetics is a net negative on society, and we should all push back against them every time they put out a piece of propaganda like this. Well, heathens, is going to be it for me today. I really appreciate y'all stopping by and watching this Genesis Apologetics video. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought. Do you have better arguments against what this guy was saying in this fake classroom? Let me know down below. Also, if you want to, down there, along with the other information, I should have a couple of other creators that have addressed these classroom videos too. People that have a lot more specific expert information. So definitely check out those links in the description. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.